Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Well, what a day in Parliament. I'll cover it all and more. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. The government remains adamant it's got no intentions, no plans to touch negative gearing. But the Greens are similarly adamant they'll force Labor's hands. When asked about it yet again today, we get a weak response from the Treasurer and the Prime Minister. Things are certainly heating up in Dunkley. New polling showing a significant swing against Labor. The coalition are leaving nothing to chance, deploying Senator Jacinta Price over the weekend. We'll catch up with Jacinta. I'm a bit keen to see how she's seeing the campaign on the ground. Plus, worrying signs for global stability with President Biden's mental faculties now officially called into question. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, the only Republican likely to secure the nomination, is attacking America's allies. And if Labor thought they'd found their feet for 2024, well, they can think again, with the inept immigration minister once again out of his depth, fielding questions over just what he's doing or not doing to keep the community safe from the foreign criminals that Labor released last year.
Minister, can you confirm that it is your position that none of these individuals pose a threat to the Australian community?
We put in place, with the cooperation of members opposite, a range of laws and also put in place a range of processes to keep the community safe. I'm very pleased that the Community Protection Board is up and running and has been providing appropriate advice on managing this cohort.
But first, it's been pretty obvious for some time now that this is the most left-wing government we've ever had. Certainly the most left-wing since Gough Whitlam. But I'm starting to think it's also the most incompetent ever. And given I saw the Rudd-Gillard years up close and personal, that says something. It's not just that our country's drifting backwards, but that the government seems incapable of doing anything about it, either because he thinks it's someone else's job or because it's all just too hard. Everywhere you look, things seem to be out of control, whether it's record high immigration that successive governments have put into the hands of universities whose business model depends on overseas students, or businesses too lazy to train local workers or pay them properly. Or it's the explosion of anti-Semitism, including regular rallies calling for what amounts to be genocide against the Jewish population of Israel that Australian police seem unwilling or unable to control. Virtually no arrests, and news over the weekend of countless Jewish families forced to move suburbs in Melbourne because their businesses and homes have been targeted. Families like Joshua and Maggie May Moshe, who up until recently have lived safely in Thornbury, but not, it seems, anymore. And all those hate-preaching Islamic imams that no one seems to have the guts to punish or deport them if they don't belong here.
If the Australian government like it or not, if the ASIO likes it or not, if they want to deport me from Australia or not, the jihad is the solution for the ummah.
It's a night of pride! It's a night of victory! This is the day we've been waiting for!
A day when the stones and the trees will speak and say, "Oh Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him."
Hamas is mujahideen and freedom fighters and warriors.
Not to mention all the lies that governments of the left want to tell us, especially that lie that going green is going to make everything cheaper, when we all know from experience that the opposite is the case. The latest example here, Minister Chris Bowen's attempt to force us into electric cars, promising it'll save motorists $1,000 or more, when he won't even release the modelling to back up his claim, a claim that almost every industry expert says is fanciful. But as poor as all of that is, today there's been just more bumbling ineptitude from ministers that have made it an art form and seem chronically incapable of doing their job to protect Australians. As exposed in the Senate hearings this morning, the 149 foreign criminals that the Albanese government released last year after the courts ordered them to release just one included, wait for it, 7 murderers, 37 sex offenders and 72 violent criminals. There were 13 drug traffickers and 5 people smugglers as well. In fact, if you look at that table, less than 5 of those released, according to the government, less than 5 only represent low-level or no criminality. Now, you are kidding me. In Question Time today, quite rightly, the man responsible, Immigration Minister Andrew Giles, was put under pressure to explain what the hell's going on yet again on his watch.
Can the Minister confirm the 7 murderers and 37 sex offenders released from detention are all wearing ankle bracelets?
And I can confirm, as I think I've made clear earlier, that the management of everyone in this cohort is determined by the professional men and women of the Community Safety Board, who have been providing evidence-based assessment on the application of those measures, the subject of laws that we all supported.
Now, did you hear that response? The Minister doesn't know. The Minister is trying to say it's got nothing to do with him, that he's outsourced it to this community board of bureaucrats to decide who should wear ankle bracelets and who should not. Now, I'm sorry, but have a look at that table again. 7 murderers, 37 sex offenders, 72 violent criminals, 13 drug traffickers, 5 people smugglers. Now, it's not too hard, is it? Every one of them should have an ankle bracelet. Every one of them should be monitored closely by police. And yet the bloke in charge, Andrew Giles, effectively telling Australians this is not something he wants to decide, that he's actually just outsourced it and is not willing to take responsibility for keeping Australians safe. Remember this last year from Home Affairs Minister, his boss, Claire O'Neill.
I wish that they could be kept in detention. If it was up to me, I would keep them in detention. I can't do that. The High Court has made a call.
These people are not people who I wanted on the streets of our country, and that is exactly why they were kept in detention until our government received a High Court ruling that we must follow, that we must release these people.
So much for that. I mean, that is BS. That is just mock outrage from the Minister, because we learned today that despite demanding those urgent laws last year to give the government the power it says it needed to re-detain some of these foreign criminals, to lock them up again, we find out the government has not made one application, not one, to lock them up.
Can the Minister explain why he has failed to apply for a single community safety detention order?
And 10 months was the shortest period of time for an application to be made to the court under members opposite, under the regime which he and other members, including the Leader of the Opposition, who was the Minister responsible for putting in place the high-risk terror offender regime. So I think that we can see this question in that light, Speaker.
I mean, what even half-competent government would just wave such people into the community, and then, when it gets the laws it says it needs to lock them up, it does nothing? It must have been bad in the eyes of the PM's minders, because they sent Albanese out this afternoon, after question time, to try and mop things up. Here's the Prime Minister on Sydney Radio.
There's a very high legal threshold to be met for a court to agree to the ongoing detention of an offender. What we want to make sure is that this is got right. There's no point putting in an application that is not successful.
Only rather than mopping up, I think the Prime Minister made it worse, because he's basically admitting there that the laws he was forced by Peter Dutton to put into the Parliament last year to fix things up, well, those laws are still woefully deficient. But what about Defence too? Another portfolio where it's got the single most important job of government. That's the job of keeping our country safe. Remember late last week, the Defence Minister admitted in the Parliament that his department wasn't up to the job. Here he is.
I make no excuses or apologies for demanding excellence and a culture of excellence in the Department of Defence and in the Australian Defence Force. And there is a way to go, before we have that culture of excellence. We are giving the Defence Force a strategic purpose. We are giving it direction.
These Labor ministers, it's always someone else's fault, isn't it? I mean, we've got a series of programs that have never worked or aren't working. There's the new offshore patrol vessels that have almost no armament. The new frigates, well, they're years behind schedule and billions over budget. Also, too, without enough missiles. Plus, there's the Tiger helicopters. Well, they've never worked properly. The Hawkeye armoured vehicle, never been brought into full operational service. And those Taipan helicopters, again, never really worked properly. They're now being stripped and buried, if you can believe it. Plus, there's that drone program that's now going to take us 8 years just to get to a decision, and that might even include training birds of prey. Yes, I'm serious, eagles as our main defence line. But at the heart of this incompetence is the government's inability to make a decision. It decided to acquire these nuclear-powered subs, fair enough, that's great, but they didn't allocate any extra money, which means every other defence program is being squeezed. And after one big inconclusive review, it then launched another big review. That review still hasn't even reported, so there's no decisions about our future armed forces at a time when the world hasn't been as dangerous as it is now in decades. Now, the best you can say about this government is that it suffers from analysis paralysis. But the more accurate assessment is they're just not competent. They are incompetent and dangerously so. As I said, pretty hectic day in Canberra. Let's go there now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Cam Redden.
The criminal records of dozens of immigration detainees released after a High Court ruling have been exposed. The ruling resulted in the release of 149 detainees, including
7 murderers, 37 sex offenders, 72 people charged with assault or armed robbery.
18 face various charges from state and territory police, while another 6 have been charged with breaching their visa conditions. Laws to establish preventative detention measures were rushed through Parliament in December, but documents tabled in Senate estimates reveal the government is yet to make a single application to re-detain any of those who've allegedly reoffended.
The minister had a very long break over summer. Perhaps they weren't at the office to sign off on the briefs.
Members of the crossbench are heaping pressure on the government to change the rules around negative gearing. Labor's Help to Buy housing scheme will be debated in Parliament this week. It will need Greens' support to pass the Senate, and the minor party has laid out its demands: a limit on negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts.
Labor's refusal to phase out billions of dollars in property investor tax concessions to property investors like yourself is denying millions of renters the chance to buy a home.
The idea that there will be a discussion with that sort of juvenile approach that we've seen from those opposite will not occur, because this is not a students' council, this is a parliament.
The Nationals party room met this morning without Barnaby Joyce, who sought to explain a video which shows him lying on a Canberra footpath late at night, swearing into his phone.
I made a big mistake. There's no excuse for it. There's a reason. It's a very eventful walk home, wasn't it?
The former Deputy Prime Minister says he was suffering the side effects of mixing alcohol with prescription medication.
And there's some personal circumstances, some of which he's articulated publicly, others that I don't intend to breach his confidence.
I'm not looking for sympathy and I'm not looking for an excuse.
Cameron Redden, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, let's get into it. Let's bring in now National Editor for The Australian, Dennis Shanahan. We'll start with question time. I think I've given people a good flavour of a shocker of a day for the Immigration Minister, Andrew Giles. I mean, we couldn't get straight answers last year. I think the government had hoped this was behind them. I think it's blown up today. I think it'll be a feature of this week. I'm going to talk to the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, Senator James Paterson, in a moment. But this is bad news for Labor, that it's back front and centre again today, Dennis.
Yes, Peter. Look, it's back to where we were at the end of last year. The whole detainee thing was a disaster last year, and the minister or ministers could not answer questions in Parliament. There had to be emergency legislation passed, And what do we find after the Parliament has been on break for close to 2 months? That today the Minister for Immigration faced all the opposition questions, all of them, and he was able to answer none of them. Now, over that period of time, one would have thought that A, he would have got across the facts, realised what he could release and what he couldn't release, so that he didn't look like a fool in Parliament. And secondly, he would have had an answer as to why they didn't exercise that emergency legislation. Now, the Prime Minister came out later and said, oh, we didn't want to make a false start. But look, the Prime Minister came out and said that later. Why didn't the Minister say it previously? I've never seen such a supine, well, that's probably a big call, but he is a very supine Minister. He reacts to everything. He doesn't take initiative. Now, this was a huge issue last year. It's going to be a huge issue again this year. And the real threat for the government, and this is the real sort of boon for the coalition, is that it is detracting from the issue of tax cuts. Because once again, the main story out of Parliament won't be the government talking about tax cuts. It will be Andrew Giles not talking about escaped criminal or released criminals, including 7 murderers and 37 sexual offenders. I mean, this is the sort of thing that people take notice of, and the Minister was totally unprepared.
Of course they do. And we know at a state level, crime's a huge issue, particularly on the eastern seaboard. You're right to point out he's had 2 months over the summer break to bone up on this issue. If nothing else, he wasn't across the details. Supine, I think you're being kind. He looks constantly at his notes. He inspires no confidence. And I think they've been caught out. I mean, if the PM's out there this afternoon trying to mop up on radio and says the legislation's tough, it's got a very high legal bar, well, I'm a lawyer. I've read the legislation. If you think it's deficient, Prime Minister, you should have fixed it when you took it through the Parliament in November. If you think it needs remediation now, the Parliament's sitting, fix it up. But you're not going to survive this in the court of public opinion, because this is the sort of stuff, Dennis, that cuts through.
Precisely. And the Minister couldn't even say how many of the serious offenders, including murders and so on, had been released without ankle bracelets. Now, I don't know, you don't have to be sort of right across operational detail, but that seems to be a pretty big political question, and that's what politicians should get across. It was a terrible performance and detracted from the government's sale of its tax cuts.
And I do remember a time in the Parliament where Tony Abbott gets screamed at for looking at his watch, and this bloke is asleep at the wheel on something as important as community safety. Talk to me about negative gearing. You wrote a terrific piece in the Oz today saying the government's sort of tap dancing around this issue. We're not getting a clean line on it. We know they're saying no plans. Well, they've said no plans in relation to stage 3 tax cut changes, and they certainly had plenty of those. And we also know how much they need the Greens, and the Greens are saying this must happen. Where's this one headed?
Well, again, today in question time, we saw the Prime Minister attacking the Greens because on negative gearing, it's not just the coalition that Labor is fighting against, it's the Greens. The coalition is coming from the right saying, rule out changes to negative gearing. We are not going to change negative gearing, just rule it out. And we've seen some pretty wishy-washy attempts to refuse to rule it out, a bit and pieces there. On Friday, Bill Shorten said, yeah, no, we're not doing it. I made a mistake last time. Today he said, to the best of my knowledge, we're not doing it. So they're all over the place on it as far as the coalition attack is concerned. And this will be an effective scare campaign. Capital gains, negative gearing, death tax, you name it, it's going to be a big scare campaign. But the other side, the Greens are demanding they get rid of negative gearing. And the Prime Minister today, he has become more and more aggressive towards the Greens, and he said, we won't negotiate with the Greens. Well, does that mean that the rent-to-buy system, a major election promise, is going to be the fodder for a double dissolution or won't be passed? Another promise that won't be made? I think these are real problems for the government, and they're coming from the coalition on one side, the Greens on the other.
Hey, lie, pants on fire when the Prime Minister says he won't negotiate with the Greens. I mean, that's where we get this right to disconnect, codicil, I guess, in the legislation. It was the Greens' amendment, this right to disconnect. And of course, until the government fixed it up, the amendment moved by the Greens actually imposed criminal penalties on employers if they were to contact their staff over the weekend. So he does negotiate with the Greens. He does it almost every time Parliament sits. I want to grab you, though, on another important issue because no one else much is picking this up. WA Teal Kate Cheney, she's bringing in a private members bill to give access, with this bill changing the law at a state level, in relation to euthanasia and allowing people to get approval for euthanasia over the phone via telehealth. Now, these are state-based laws, but the telephone component is federal. This is where she buys herself into it. But these laws around the country now have barely been fully operational for a year, but already the push is on to water them down. Now, I have a concern about our most vulnerable. Surely it's not too much to ask that we keep the protection in the laws as they stand, that if you want euthanasia, you must be seen in person by a doctor. I mean, how do you even verify someone's identity over the phone?
Yeah, look, I think that this is an attempt by the Teals to come in and on the federal level on euthanasia and voluntary assisted dying. The argument is, we've got to make sure that people have equal access to medical treatment, and telehealth has become such a common way to do that, and people in remote communities can then be able to use telehealth. But it's a different matter to actually say people can access euthanasia by telehealth. And by the way, she's from Western Australia. And in Western Australia and the Northern Territory, there are some very vulnerable remote communities of indigenous people who are very much against the idea of euthanasia, and particularly with remote treatment for women. This was the case. There were people who were very concerned about, in indigenous areas, about the release of the abortion pill and being able to send people into remote areas, medication which actually could have endangered their lives. So to say it's about equal treatment is wrong, and I think that the federal government should stick by the control it does have to ensure, at least after these state laws have been in place for 2 or 3 years or 4 or 5 years, before it actually waters them down already. We've seen the experience overseas that once they come in, they are watered down, and you get to the stage where you have people being euthanized without reference to relatives, to people of young age and so forth. So I think that this is a dangerous move by the Teals.
And I also add, in places like Canada and certainly in parts of Europe, euthanasia without needing or not having a terminal illness. Dennis Shanahan, thank you. All right, new polling out of the Victorian electorate of Dunkley is showing a massive swing against Labor. While the Labor polling shows their candidate slightly ahead 3 weeks out from the ballot, that margin is tightening. 4.3% swing there, it says, against the government, even after their tax cuts for all pledge. For a bit more on this, I'm joined by Northern Territory Senator, of course, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price. Well, great to have you on. This is actually not about your portfolio. I want your campaigning skills. I want a sense from you what it feels like on the ground in Dunkley, because I know you were the star of the show down there on the weekend. What's it feel like? What are voters raising with you, Jacinta?
Oh, look, they're raising the fact that, they're not convinced. They haven't had the wool pulled over their eyes to the $15 a week for Australians, with regard to the tax cuts that the government has passed, because they have seen straight through it. And a lot of that comes from the fact that, there were a lot of Labor voters in the area that voted no during the referendum. And there are actually people who came up to us who stated that they were long-term Labor voters, and that because of the referendum, because of the backflip on promises and the continuation of broken promises, they just can't believe the conduct of the Albanese government, but they also mentioned the conduct of the Victorian government and how they've explained that Daniel Andrews has ruined many lives. And so that's bled into now this federal by-election going forward. So a lot of those voters aren't silly. They have been hurt by both governments, but certainly by the Albanese government, and they simply don't trust him. And we had a number of people who were long-term Labor voters come up to us and state those things.
Well, trust is a big thing at the moment with the Prime Minister because, of course, despite the voice referendum result overwhelmingly saying no, we don't want race in our constitution, the Prime Minister's still got treaty on the table. We know there's millions for it in the budget. There's still a whole unit in the department, hasn't been disbanded, still working on Makarrata. I mean, what doesn't the government understand about the vote last year?
I have no idea what they don't understand, and there are a number of questions that I will be asking the NIAA around this funding that exists for Makarrata and for treaty. I imagine that the states and territories that are trying to implement treaty or going through their negotiations at the moment, that they would then probably seek support from the federal government to do so. Right now, the federal government can claim that they're not doing anything, but I feel there's probably movement by stealth in order when it comes to treaty and Makarrata. But it's simply wrong. The Australian people have expressed their position on it. They don't want to be divided along the lines of race. We shouldn't be attempting to hold treaties with our own citizens, and we can't continue to provide an environment where opportunists take advantage of the situation.
Of course, the Senate's not sitting in the usual way. You've got Senate estimates this week. I think this is why we're finding out the things we are about the detainees and other issues. You were in the hot seat today, going after some questions regarding the Environmental Defenders Office. I know the Coalition has said, if elected, we'll scrap funding or taxpayer funding for this organisation. But you're pretty concerned about these allegations of witness coaching, aren't you?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what the High Court has found, that there has been witness coaching, there has been misleading traditional owners. I mean, I've heard from traditional owner groups themselves about many who will in fact avoid the Environmental Defenders Office because of the way that they conduct themselves, and they will single out individuals and then pit people against one another. When I asked, of course, the Minister, would Minister Plibersek, why hasn't she apologised yet to the traditional owners that have been affected in this case? There was no real answer as to why. And I asked, of course, will she apologise? But no such apology seems to be on the horizon for these traditional owners. But I've said it so many times that there are many Indigenous Australians in these places that are taken advantage of by those with their own political agendas and ideologies, and it has to stop.
Jacinta, great to catch up with you as always. Well done on your Dunkley campaign. We'll see what happens. I think it's early March we've got that by-election. Thanks for your time. All right, after the break, we'll get into some other issues. The Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson will join me. We'll get into that news today about those released detainees. No application, some of the worst still out in the street. No ankle bracelets either. I tell you, it's shocking. Plus, Biden looking more feeble by the day, and Trump lashing out at America's own allies. Over the weekend, of course, it was NATO. Big winners here are China, Russia, perhaps even Iran. Welcome back. Still to come, Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson. That immigration debacle, still more today from the House. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, defence matters. And I want to start with a speech Donald Trump gave to a weekend rally in South Carolina, where he recalled a conversation he had with an unnamed NATO member and what he would let Russia do to them. Have a listen.
One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
Well, the response from NATO has been swift, with the head of NATO saying Trump's putting the lives of US and allied troops at risk. Joining me now, senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Malcolm Davis. Well, Malcolm, I have to say, regardless of your views about Trump, and I do think he's absolutely right to be pushing NATO to pull its financial weight. It's supposed to fund defence in Europe. It relies too heavily on America. I'm with him on all of that. This is a worrying sign, perhaps, of a new American isolationism, though, if Trump is to win. How do you see it?
Look, I would agree with you, Peter. I think that what you've seen over the weekend is Donald Trump essentially indicating that he fully intends to betray NATO's most important element of its charter, Article 5, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. And at the same time, he's indicated that he fully supports Russia attacking NATO states. That, to me, is a gross betrayal of NATO's trust, and it should be sending warning signals flashing bright scarlet red around the world about Donald Trump's intentions, not just in regards to NATO, but in terms of the US relationship with other key allies in the Indo-Pacific, such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And so I think that we should be extremely worried about Trump's actions and words here.
And of course, if he doesn't win, you've got an increasingly concerning Joe Biden running for another term in the White House. I don't think he scares anyone around the world. And then here at home, you think that would make us redouble our efforts to be ready in the case of concerns, at least in our region, perhaps beyond. But more reports today about this escalating rift between the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, his office, and his own Defence Department. These are today in the Australian Financial Review. We know it was the Australian over the weekend. Talk about a closed-door meeting late last year between Marles and his secretary, Greg Moriarty, who I know well, regard him well, Chief of the Defence Force Angus Campbell. The meeting has been described by some as uncomfortable, and one former senior defence bureaucrat off the record who was there said, Marles doesn't respect them, and they sure as hell don't respect him. I mean, is this relationship gone beyond the point of repair?
Look, I think that we are in the most dangerous strategic environment since the Second World War. I put a tweet out on the weekend essentially saying this is 1937 in 2024. And it's incumbent on both the Minister and also the Chiefs of the Department of Defence to work together as a team in this very dangerous and dire strategic environment where we are, I think, in a pre-war situation akin to the 1930s, to work together to bring defence capability into service as quickly as possible. And that's not happening. We're not seeing progress being made on key capability decisions coming out of the Defence Strategic Review from last year. We're moving too slowly, we are just drifting along, and there's no leadership on either side. There's no responsibility. And I would add, it's not just about Marles or the top-level bureaucrats in defence. Albanese needs to take some leadership here and get things in hand. So this is a very worrying sign indeed.
We'll stay across it, Malcolm. Thank you for your time. I must say, Greg Moriarty there, the Secretary of Defence Department, was integral to stopping the boats in the Abbott government years. That's where I know him from. And, well, you can see the results of all that. He was pretty astounding. Outstanding. All right, let's go now to that whole shambolic display today in Question Time. The Home Affairs and Immigration Ministers under the gun. 149 free detainees. Not one preventative detention application having been lodged, we find out, by the government. And then those documents, you saw them put to screen before, found out this morning, of course, by James Paterson. 7 murderers, 37 sex offenders, 72 violent criminals and more. Joining me now, the man who has helped us uncover this all, Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, James Paterson. Well, thank you for your time. I tell you, if you had not pursued this, James Paterson, would we even know this sort of detail?
Unfortunately, no, Peter, we wouldn't know it at all because the Prime Minister and his government made a decision over the summer break to stop reporting this information, to stop revealing it to the public And it was only through the process of Senate estimates that we're able to force the Department of Home Affairs to finally cough up this information, to finally admit how many murderers there are in that cohort, 7, how many sex offenders there are in that cohort, 37, how many other violent criminals are in that cohort, 72, how many domestic violence perpetrators are in that cohort, 12, and the fact that the government has not made one single application to the courts under the preventative detention regime that the Parliament rushed through the Parliament before Christmas 2 months ago. So I don't know what ministers and their departments have been up to over summer, but it's not protecting the community.
Yeah, and just on that point, I mean, the Prime Minister goes out to Sydney Radio this afternoon trying to mop up from that debacle we saw from his minister, and he makes the point that the threshold, the bar for legal action is high, he's doing all this work behind the scenes, blah, blah, blah. But if he's not happy with the fix they put into the Parliament last year, he's the bloke responsible. I mean, this was his legislation. If he thinks it is deficient, he could have remedied it in the Parliament this year.
Exactly right, Peter. There were multiple opportunities to do that if he chose to, but they haven't brought through any legislation at all. I mean, why did the Parliament rush through this legislation before Christmas if they planned to take a leisurely, long summer, slowly going through the processes, not devoting sufficient resources to it, not prioritising the highest risk among them, and not getting those applications before the court? Because, of course, once you make the application to the court will take its own time to consider it, which we can't directly control. The only thing we can control is when those applications are made. And so for them not to have made one application, maybe we should just start with the murderers, or we could start with the child sex offenders. I don't expect all of the 149 to be behind bars now, but just one would be nice, and they haven't even managed to do that.
It couldn't even tell us, though, James, who has an ankle bracelet, which itself is not great, but at least it means they're monitored in some way. He couldn't even put that information into the Parliament, and he had this so weak line that he's got a panel to outsource and make those decisions. Now, we elect ministers to make decisions. I mean, surely he's got to go.
There's a total absence of political leadership from the top to the bottom here, from the Prime Minister, from the Minister for Home Affairs and from the Minister for Immigration. And can I tell you, in fresh news, hot off the press, straight out of Senate estimates just a few moments ago, the Department and Border Force are not able to tell us how many of the 18 people who've been released into the community who've committed new offences and been charged for new offences are in custody. All the Border Force officials are able to say is they think some of them are in custody and some of them are out in the community, but they've got no idea. I mean, these are people who've not just offended once, which is what landed them in prison or immigration detention originally. Since they've been released, they've offended again, and they've got no idea where these people are or whether or not they're in the community, and that is just a travesty.
And they don't meet the refugee test under international law. They're of bad character. Even their own countries don't want them back. But we're not locking them up. We're not monitoring them. We've got them out in the community. We've got them on welfare. Taxpayers are paying for them to live somewhere. They've got access to medical care. The whole box and dice. I just have never seen anything like it. I think this is absolutely staggering. I want to ask you a question as a Victorian senator, because it was a real talking point with everyone I spoke to over the weekend. We have this woman, a mum, that goes missing in Ballarat. We go looking for her. The police and SES are out there for a couple of days. She's been missing for a week. There's no real leads. Why on earth have we disbanded the search? I mean, how can someone go missing in Australia and after a week we just give up?
Peter, like you as a fellow Victorian, I'm very distressed by this news. It makes no sense to me at all why this woman has disappeared and why, after just a week of searching, that search has been disbanded. I hope it's because there's a very good reason why, and they have some information, but that hasn't been shared with the public if it's known to police. Surely we should be continuing all efforts until there is a reasonable prospect of finding her or understanding where she's gone. I mean, I know a lot of Victorians are very distressed by this right now.
Are you going to keep pursuing this detention issue?
Absolutely. We'll be back after the dinner break in Senate estimates from 7:30 tonight, where there's a whole range of unanswered questions. I mean, among that cohort, 36 people that were not given ankle bracelets. Border Force wasn't able to tell us how many of them have reoffended now that they're in the community and whether or not they pose a risk to the community. It's just worse and worse and worse.
Thank God we've got you on our side, Senator James Paterson. Thank you for your time. Right after the break, more evidence of how the unions are trying to use big super to control your money. Plus, for a government that vowed transparency, it looks like there's a very little scrutiny to nearly $1 billion in government grants. More on that shortly. All right, still plenty of headlines I want to get you across tonight. My panel bringing them in now. Sky News contributor, former Howard Government Minister Gary Hargreaves, and LNP MP, former Resources Minister Keith Pitt. Well, gents, welcome on a Monday, as always.
Peter.
Gary, I'll start with you. Big super. I wrote about this in The Australian last week, tried to unmask what's going on with the unions and Labor controlling our money. Big super want our money. They're pushing pretty hard. Australian Super, one of the funds, is seeking permission from the Treasury Department to set up an account for life, they call it, which would effectively merge the accumulation and retirement accounts of Australians. Now, many of these super funds, as you know, are dominated by the unions. They're run by a vast coterie of former Labor politicians. This is a power grab, isn't it?
Absolutely, Peter, and it's proof that they don't trust you with your money or any of us with our money. They're saying that if you've got own less, you'll be happier. It's the World Economic Forum. It's this all international lefty socialist approach to all of this. They don't want you to buy a house with money you might have in your superannuation, but they'll take your money and buy a house for somebody else. I mean, these are the sorts of things that are going on right now. I think that this would make the Politburo in Beijing blush. Cradle to grave administration of everything you do. You go to work and you hand over your money, and 12% of the wage that your boss pays now goes to these union-controlled super. And if you don't join a union, well, it doesn't matter because they've got your money anyway. And so there's so many things are wrong here. It is a big power grab, and it's all about financing their control, their change of what Australia currently is, and making, frankly, things a lot worse.
Well, Keith's right there. CBUS, one of the big funds, has put $500 million into welfare housing. CBUS, of course, is the CFMEU's super fund of choice, but they won't let you put your money into housing. Just on the same vein here, Keith, the number of apprentices and trainees in the first year of the Albanese government, that's fallen by more than 50,000, despite their fee-free TAFE program. Now, this says to me we're just importing more and more people and we're not training our own kids.
Peter, the Albanese government has been screaming skills shortages, they've been screaming housing shortages, and those things are all true for the last 12 months. And now we find we've lost 50,000 apprentices. There were record trade apprentice numbers under our government, under the coalition government, and the majority of them will be in the construction field. This is 50,000 that potentially help you build those houses, that help you address that skills shortage, and they've been lost. And instead, as you've pointed out, some 500,000 new immigrants into the country who simply don't have housing to be put into, jobs to go to, but it's good for Anthony Albanese's Labor vote. So as a former tradesperson, Peter, I find this appalling. We could have had these kids almost turned out in another 18 months.
It's shocking. What about this news too, Gary? The Commonwealth Auditor General says they're launching a probe into the Albanese government's $2.2 billion spend in the Victorian suburban rail loop. Very controversial project. A lot of calls for it to be scrapped. Now, if the Auditor General's looking at it, that's a real worry.
Well, of course it is, but this seems like a promise that the Prime Minister made when he didn't think he was going to win the election. So he's suddenly got to be accountable for his promise. And, you know, it's all tied in together. You've got the superannuation funds who are changing the way our electricity is generated, changing the way we build houses. You've got the union movement saying that you can't import labour with skills into this country unless they join the union. You just know, Peter, on all these fronts, there's so many things that are wrong. And then the Prime Minister makes this sort of good on your back-slapping mate kind of contribution at the last federal election. And now the Auditor General saying, well, hang on a second, this has got dodgy written all over it. So, you know, we had the same problem here in Queensland with the Cross River Rail project, which has no end in sight and no likelihood that the real cost of it's ever going to be known. Any other infrastructure, Australia said, we're not going to fund it. So this is all about boondoggles and all sorts of money laundering, frankly, for the union movement. Money out of the taxpayers' pocket through the unions, safety officers galore, hardly anybody on the tools, and you can't import people with skills. So everywhere you look, Peter, Suburban Loop is just another example of this complete rorting of Australia as we know it.
And I might add, it's a rail loop we do not need. And at the same time, we've got all these road projects of roads we actually use that are going begging, that haven't got the money, not just in Victoria, right around the country. Researchers, Keith, Deakin University, they say there's nearly $1 billion in government grants being handed out right now, nearly $1 billion, no scrutiny, almost no strings attached. I mean, this is pork barrelling writ large.
Oh, Peter, as a former minister in the previous government, I signed plenty of grants, I've got to tell you, to the Murray-Darling. And there were occasions where I had a different view, as did my staff, to what was put forward by the public service, and for very good reason. If you look at some of these things, I remember there was a cap on administration of 10%, and in a $100,000 project, as an example, you'd find admin at 10% and project management at 40%. Now, that sounds the same to me, 50 grand out of the price of the project. It wasn't value for money. So there was quite a lot of that getting around. But we do need to make sure that the taxpayer gets their value. But I've got to tell you, I oppose this idea that the minister is powerless, that the minister has no right to make a decision. We are elected, we're in government to be the government of the day, and we take the responsibility. There are very clear guidelines that have to be met. But the idea that the country is run entirely by the public service and the minister has no say, well, I just don't agree with it.
It's called doxing, Gary, and you'll explain to viewers what that actually means. But in this case, over the weekend, we find a whole bunch of Jewish Australians, particularly in suburbs of Melbourne, we'll call them progressive suburbs, left-leaning suburbs, have had their businesses, vandalised out the front. They've been named and shamed on social media for no other reason than they're Jewish, and they're leaving their homes, their suburbs, their businesses, moving to other parts of Melbourne where they feel a little bit more safe. Now, this is the sort of stuff we saw in 35, 36, 1937, 39, Europe. I mean, this is appalling.
Shame.
Well, of course it is. And Peter, the problem is this is what's happening in this country. We've got the left internationally telling us how we can't have our own money. We've got to contribute it to the union movement. The union movement are telling us we can't bring people with trade skills to this country because we've just simply got to suffer. We've got the Chinese government owning a whole bunch of our water resources, a whole lot of our food resources, and now they're trying to give us prefabricated buildings for housing. That's the three things in Maslow's hierarchy of need. We're trying to split apart our society based on race and culture and stuff. And the Prime Minister's showing no leadership when it comes to bringing people together. He's all about creating separate tribes and having gatekeepers at the front of each of those tribes. This is a very, very dangerous time we find ourselves in. The Jewish community are always the canary in the coal mine when it comes to community relations. If they're suffering, who's next is my view. Who is next? And I think all Australians of all backgrounds, all beliefs should be gravely concerned about the lack of leadership from the bloke who's living in two lots of public housing, one in Canberra, one in Sydney. He's called the Prime Minister.
And I might add too, you've got a whole lot of Labor left MPs, Muslim leaders. They want the resumption of that money being paid to the Palestinian Authority, taxpayers' money. I hope we don't buckle on that. Keith, what's the story with these solar farms? They get built. They're only just now being connected to the grid, but they're not running at full capacity. What's going on?
Peter, I've got to tell you, they never run at full capacity apart from a couple of hours a day. In fact, the story at 25%, that's what they do on average. If you want to average 1,000 megawatts, well, you've got to build 5,000 to do that. And sometimes you'll get 5,000 and during the night, guess what? You'll get none. So you've got to build something else entirely. This is the fundamental problem with intermittent wind and solar. If it works for you as a hybrid, great, fantastic. But the idea you can run the Australian economy on something that turns itself off when it feels like it or a cloud comes over the top, I think that's dangerous for our country. It's dangerous for the economy. And you've got to cover the entire country in transmission lines. It is incredibly expensive. And even the Northern Territory, it's a big place. They're a long way apart. And they still won't do what's necessary because physics, engineering, economics are the things that we should be making decisions on. And the first thing we should make a decision on, Peter, is Does it work? And if it doesn't work, we shouldn't install it.
Exactly.
All right, you've just proved the point why we need real people in the parliament. Given your background as an electrical engineer, you've brought all that experience to the fore. Thank you for the education. I'll see you next week. Bye. All right, that's it for me. Back tomorrow night at 6. Parliament's on. Geez, it's going to be a fight tomorrow. Here's Andrew Bolt.